My name is Jake Roberts, and I'm 42. This story takes place last fall at Oak Ridge, the highest peak in Oregon. I had just finalized my divorce, packed up my things, and hit the road in an RV that still smelled like a dealership. I told myself I was reconnecting with nature, hoping to find some clarity, but deep down, I was running away from guilt, loneliness, and the mess of my broken life. I chose Oak Ridge because it was remote, and that's what I thought I needed: solitude. What I didn't know were the stories about the Phantom Rock. If I had, maybe I would have turned around. But honestly, I'm not sure I could have. I arrived late in the afternoon, the sun slipping behind the mountains. I parked my RV near the summit and set up a small fire. The forest was thick with trees, standing tall and dark as the light faded. I sat by the fire with a cold cup of coffee when I met Sam. He was a big, tough-looking guy, like someone who had spent his whole life in the mountains. I had stopped at the trailhead earlier to grab a map, and he must have noticed my out-of-state plates, so he came over to introduce himself. "You new around here?" he asked. "Just passing through," I replied. We talked about the trails and the weather for a while. Then Sam mentioned the Phantom Rock. "Ever heard of it?" he asked. I hadn't, so he told me about it. "There's a big, smooth boulder deep in the woods. People say if you touch it, you can make a wish. But there's always a price." I laughed nervously. "What's the price?" "Sometimes it's your sanity. Sometimes it's worse." His voice was serious, and even though I tried to laugh it off, his words stayed with me. The first night was quiet, but the next day, strange things started happening. I went on one of Sam's recommended trails, hoping to clear my head. The forest was eerily quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the sound of my boots on the path. I noticed a side trail, overgrown and unmarked. I don't know why, but I felt drawn to it. I followed it through the trees until I came to a clearing. In the middle stood a huge black boulder, smooth like glass. The trees around it were dead, their branches bare. Something about the place made me feel uneasy. I didn't stay long. That night, I heard a soft tapping on the side of the RV. At first, I thought it was nothing, but then it started again. I looked outside, but there was no one there. The next morning, I found small handprints in the dirt, outside the RV, like they'd been left by a child. I tried to ignore it, but later that day, I saw her. She was standing just off the trail, a teenage girl with pale skin and long, dark hair. She wore a tattered old dress, and her eyes were wide with fear. "Are you lost?" I asked. She nodded but didn't speak. I stepped toward her, but before I could get close, she turned and ran into the woods. I chased after her, calling for her to wait, but she disappeared. All that was left was a faint trail of footprints leading toward the clearing. Later, I couldn't shake the image of her empty eyes, and how she just vanished. That night, I dreamed about the Phantom Rock. The girl was sitting on the boulder, her hands resting on its smooth surface. "It can give you what you want," she whispered. When I woke up, I couldn't get her words out of my head. The next morning, I decided to go back to the boulder. It felt like I had no choice. The trail was easier to find now, almost like it was waiting for me. The clearing looked the same, with the boulder looming in the center. The air felt heavy, like it was pressing against my chest. And there she was again, standing by the rock. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice shaking. She didn't answer. Instead, she placed her hand on the boulder and whispered, "It can give you what you want." I hesitated. The thought of getting my family back, of hearing my kids' laughter, and seeing my ex-wife smile again, flooded my mind. The idea of a second chance was too tempting. Before I could stop myself, I reached out and touched the rock. At first, nothing happened, but then I felt a faint vibration beneath my fingers. That afternoon, my phone rang. It was my ex-wife. "I've been thinking about us," she said. "Maybe we should talk." I felt a spark of hope, thinking the rock had worked. But that night, the girl came back. She stood outside the RV, her face pressed against the window. Her eyes were no longer filled with fear. They were dark and empty. "You made your wish," she whispered. "Now, it's time to pay." The lights in the RV flickered, and shadows twisted inside. I grabbed a flashlight and ran outside, shouting, "What do you want from me?" Her voice echoed from everywhere. "It's not me, it's the rock." Terrified, I ran back to the clearing. The forest seemed alive, closing in around me. When I reached the boulder, it looked bigger, pulsing like it was alive. The girl appeared again, flickering like a broken video. "You can undo it," she said, "but you can stop it from taking more." I grabbed a hammer from my pack and swung it at the boulder. The impact sent a shockwave through the clearing, and the girl screamed as the rock cracked in half. The air grew still, and she vanished into mist. The next morning, the boulder was gone, replaced by rubble. I returned to the RV and called my ex-wife, apologizing for everything. I realized that if we were going to have any chance at reconciliation, it had to come from me, not from some cursed rock. As I drove away from Oak Ridge, I saw her one last time in the trees. She wasn't smiling, but she wasn't angry either. She was just watching. Sometimes, the things we want most come at a price too steep to pay. And sometimes we have to let go to move forward. My name is Sarah Davis, and I'm 29 years old. This happened last October at Wildwood Falls State Park in West Virginia. I had just landed my first solo freelance assignment, a travel feature for an outdoor magazine. It was my chance to prove to myself, and maybe to a few others, that I could thrive on my own after leaving a toxic relationship. I never expected the park's beauty to be overshadowed by whispers from the past, or that those whispers would grow louder each night. When I first arrived, the park was everything I'd hoped for. My RV was parked at a secluded site with a perfect view of the gorge. The roar of the falls echoed in the distance, and Wildwood Falls was like something out of a photographer's dream. Water cascading down in mist, surrounded by vibrant autumn leaves in fiery reds and oranges. The first day was perfect. I hiked, took hundreds of photos, and scribbled notes about the trails and wildlife. The peace and quiet felt like a balm after months of stress. That evening, I sat by the fire, sipping tea and reviewing my shots, when I saw it for the first time. In one of my photos, at the edge of the frame, a figure stood between two trees. It was a man, dressed in ragged clothes, his face shadowed and blurred. I frowned, zooming in, but the details remained unclear. I didn't recall seeing anyone on my hike, and the figure hadn't appeared in any other photos. I shrugged it off as an optical illusion, maybe just a trick of light, and went to bed. But something didn't feel right. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The second day was filled with more strange encounters. I stopped by the visitor center in the morning, hoping for some local insights. The woman behind the counter, Kate, was friendly but kept watching me too closely. She eyed my camera gear and smiled knowingly. "Planning to photograph the falls?" she asked. "Yep, that's the plan," I replied. Kate hesitated, her smile faltering. "Be careful around the falls, especially near dusk," she said quietly. "The dead don't like company." I blinked, caught off guard. "Excuse me?" Before I could ask more, she turned to help another guest, leaving me with a vague sense of unease. Later, on a trail near the falls, I bumped into Marcus, a park ranger. He was tall, with a weathered face, and had a friendly attitude. As he gave me a quick rundown of the park's history, I mentioned Kate's warning. He chuckled. "Oh, that's just local folklore," he said. During the Civil War, a Confederate soldier hid out in the gorge after deserting his regiment. Some folks say his spirit never left, but I've worked here for years and never seen anything strange. I tried to laugh along with him, but his words lingered in my mind. That evening, I set up my tripod near the falls to capture the golden hour light. As I framed the shot, something unusual happened. The air around me turned cold, and my breath fogged in front of me, even though the weather was mild. My camera lens wouldn't focus, shuddering as if something was blocking it. Then, faint but unmistakable, I heard whispers. I spun around, expecting to see other hikers, but there was no one. The whispers grew louder, overlapping, like a crowd talking just out of earshot. The feeling of unease became unbearable, and I hurried back to my RV as the last light of day faded. That night, I reviewed my photos. Most were stunning. The falls bathed in warm light, but in 3 of them, the figure from the previous day appeared again. This time, he was closer, standing at the water's edge. His face was clearer now, pale, gaunt, with dark hollows where his eyes should have been. In the last photo, he was staring directly at the camera. I slammed my laptop shut and locked the RV door. The next morning, I debated cutting the trip short, but something inside me wouldn't let go. I had always prided myself on being rational, and I wasn't going to let a few strange occurrences ruin my assignment. While hiking near the falls, I noticed a hidden, overgrown side trail. Curiosity tugged at me, so I followed it. It led to a small clearing where the air felt heavier, almost suffocating. In the center of the clearing, nearby, was a patch of disturbed earth, was an old leather journal, as if something had been buried there long ago. Its pages were brittle but legible. The entries were written in looping, old-fashioned handwriting, and they told the story of a Confederate soldier who had deserted his regiment and fled into the gorge. His words were filled with fear and desperation. "The nights grow colder, and I hear them coming. I cannot outrun my fate." The last entry read, "They will find me tonight. I will not see another sunrise." I closed the journal, my hands trembling. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the oppressive feeling returned. The RV's lights flickered, and shadows began to move across the walls, twisting in ways that didn't match the firelight outside. Then I saw him. The soldier stood at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the firelight. He didn't blink, didn't move, but his hollow eyes locked onto mine. My chest tightened with fear as I realized he wasn't alone. Shadows emerged from the trees, darker and more twisted. Their forms wriggled like smoke, and their voices whispered accusations. "Traitor, coward, you will not leave." Panicked, I grabbed the journal and held it up. "Is this what you want?" I shouted. The soldier's expression shifted. Maybe it was sadness, maybe gratitude. He gestured toward the disturbed earth. I understood. Clutching the journal, I ran back to the clearing. The shadows followed, their whispers growing louder. My hands shook as I placed the journal on the grave and whispered a quiet prayer for peace. The air around me grew still. The shadows stopped, their forms dissolving into the night. The soldier lingered for a moment, his hollow eyes softening before he vanished into the mist. By morning, the oppressive feeling had lifted. The forest felt brighter, the air lighter, and for the first time in days, I felt safe. Before leaving, I stopped by the visitor center to return the journal. Kate was there, and her knowing smile greeted me. "You helped him, didn't you?" she asked softly. I nodded, unsure of what to say. She patted my hand gently. He's free now. You did a good thing. As I drove away from Wildwood Falls, I realized that the experience had changed me. I didn't have all the answers, but I no longer felt the weight of doubt and fear that had followed me into the park. Sometimes the past lingers in ways we can't explain, and sometimes all it takes to move forward is to lay it to rest. My name is Jake Harris. I'm 36, and I used to be a firefighter. This happened in Black Creek Backcountry, West Virginia, about a year after I lost my wife, Laura. I had planned the trip hoping to find peace, or at least some distraction in nature. What I found was something I'll never forget. It started as a simple RV camping trip, my first time alone. Laura and I had always loved the outdoors, and I thought this would help me reconnect with that part of my life. Black Creek, with its waterfalls and deep forests, seemed like the perfect place to be alone with my thoughts. I told myself the solitude would help, that it was what I needed, but I wasn't prepared for what came next. The drive into the backcountry was uneventful at first, with the gravel road stretching endlessly between towering trees. I stopped at a small gas station near the turnoff, where an older woman named Betty ran the counter. "You're heading into Black Creek?" she asked, as I paid for firewood and snacks. "Yeah, just me and the RV," I said. Betty gave me a strange look, pausing over the register. "Be careful out there," she said, lowering her voice. "These woods aren't kind to those traveling alone." I wanted to ask her more, but she quickly turned away to help another customer. Her words stayed with me as I drove the final stretch. The campsite near Crystal Springs was everything I'd hoped for. Quiet, beautiful, and completely isolated. I parked the RV near the creek, its soft sound a calming backdrop as I unpacked. That night, I sat by the fire, sipping coffee and gazing at the stars. For the first time in months, I felt calm. The next evening, things started to feel off. The day had been perfect. I hiked to the falls, took photos, and jotted notes in a journal I'd started after Laura's death. I even smiled a few times, thinking about how much she would have loved the view. But as I made my way back to camp, an uneasy feeling crept over me. The woods were too quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the sound of my boots crunching on the trail. When I reached the RV, the unease deepened. My firewood, neatly stacked by the pit, was scattered across the ground. At first, I thought an animal had gotten into it, but the pieces were arranged strangely, like they had been tossed deliberately. I shrugged it off and rebuilt the fire, telling myself I was just imagining things. That night, as I sat by the fire, I saw it for the first time. A shadow moved between the trees. It wasn't the flicker of firelight. This was deliberate, like someone pacing at the edge of the forest. My heart raced as I stood up and called out, "Hello!" My own voice startled me, but there was no answer. Grabbing my flashlight, I shone it into the trees, but there was nothing there. As I turned back to the fire, I saw movement in my peripheral vision. A shape, humanoid but wrong, slipping behind a tree before disappearing. I spent that night in the RV, doors locked, curtains drawn tight. The third day brought even more strange signs. I woke up to find muddy footprints leading from the creek to the RV. They looked human, but were elongated, the toes too long. The prints stopped abruptly a few feet from the door, as if the person or whatever it was had vanished. That afternoon, while hiking toward an overlook, I found something even stranger. Symbols carved into the rocks, unlike any markings I had ever seen. They looked almost like they had been burned into the stone. The air around the rocks felt heavier, like the forest was holding its breath. I hurried back to camp, but the unease followed me. That night, The shadows returned. This time, they were closer. I sat by the fire, gripping my flashlight like a weapon. The shadowy figure appeared again, standing motionless at the edge of the trees. It was tall, too tall, and its limbs were unnaturally long. "Who are you?" I shouted, my voice breaking. The figure didn't move. The fire flickered, its flames shrinking, like something was smothering it. I stumbled backward, nearly dropping the flashlight. When I looked again, the figure was gone. By the fourth morning, I had enough. I packed up, determined to leave. But when I tried to start the RV, the engine cranked, but wouldn't turn over. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. Deciding to hike back to the gas station for help, I marked my trail with sticks and rocks, hoping to avoid getting lost. But the forest had other plans. No matter which way I went, the paths looped back to my campsite. I walked for hours, my legs aching, only to find myself standing in front of the RV again. As the sun set, the shadows returned. This time, there were more of them. Figures moving through the trees, their glowing yellow eyes piercing the dark. I barricaded myself inside the RV, clutching a flare gun I'd brought for emergencies. The shadows circled outside, their footsteps echoing unnaturally loud in the silence. Then, the radio came on. Static filled the air, followed by a song I hadn't heard since Laura's funeral. It was her favorite. Hearing it now made my blood run cold. Her voice followed, faint and pleading. "Jake, leave." I stared at the radio, my hands trembling. "Laura?" Her voice came again, softer this time. "You have to go." The shadows pressed against the windows, their figures blocking the light. Panicking, I fired the flare through the nearest window. The red light blazed, and the shadows recoiled, their shapes dissolving like smoke. I didn't stop to think. I grabbed the keys and tried the ignition one last time. The engine roared to life. I drove through the night, my hands white-knuckled on the wheel. The trees seemed to bend unnaturally, as if trying to block my escape. When I finally reached the gas station, Betty was waiting. She didn't seem surprised to see me. Her expression was unreadable. "You saw it, didn't you?" she asked. I nodded, unable to speak. Betty sighed. "It's the Shadow Man. He feeds on grief and fear. He doesn't kill. He traps you, keeps you lost in the dark, until there's nothing left." The next day, I left West Virginia and vowed never to return. The shadows are gone, but sometimes, late at night, I hear faint footsteps outside my window, and I wonder if the Shadow Man ever truly let me go. My name is Ryan Taylor, and I'm 38 years old. This happened last fall, when I went to investigate a famous ghost story at Black Hollow in West Virginia. I've spent years debunking paranormal claims and cryptid sightings for my YouTube channel, Reality Check. I figured Black Hollow would be no different, but I was wrong. I arrived at the trailhead late in the afternoon, the sun casting long, fiery orange shadows across the jagged cliffs. Black Hollow stretched out before me, rocky outcroppings and dense woods. The campground was deserted, just me, my RV, and a few abandoned fire pits, overrun with weeds, perfect for filming. I set up my equipment, cameras, microphones, even a drone for aerial shots. I expected nothing more than the usual sounds of nature, but something about the place felt off. The local legend that brought me here seemed ridiculous. A group of hikers claimed they heard chanting and saw glowing symbols near the ridge. It went viral online, and I thought a simple debunking video would be an easy hit. But as I looked at the cliffs, there was something about them that unsettled me. It wasn't just the isolation. The rocks seemed to be watching, waiting. After setting up camp, I hiked up to the ridge for some initial footage. The trail was steep, winding through a forest of twisted ancient trees. Their gnarled branches formed a canopy that filtered the sunlight into strange shifting patterns. Halfway up, I found the first symbol carved into a rock. At first I thought it was graffiti, but it looked old, too precise to be recent, like something out of an ancient language textbook. I snapped a photo and moved on, brushing it off as a prank. As I climbed higher, I started to hear a faint humming. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't birds. This sound was rhythmic, almost like chanting. I stopped and held my breath to listen, but as soon as I tried to pinpoint the sound, it stopped. By the time I reached the ridge, the sun was setting, casting long shadows over the forest. I launched my drone to capture some aerial footage, but just as it flew into the sky, the feed cut out. Confused, I stared at the screen. The drone was still airborne, but the signal was lost. A few seconds later, it plummeted from the sky, crashing somewhere in the trees. Frustrated, I made a note to retrieve it in the morning and headed back to camp. The first few hours of night were uneventful. I sat inside my RV while editing the day's footage, making plans for the next day. Around midnight, I stepped outside to check the cameras I'd set up around the site. That's when I saw the lights. They flickered along the ridge, moving slowly like lanterns swaying in the wind. I grabbed my binoculars and focused in. What I saw sent a chill down my spine. A figure stood at the edge of the cliff, shrouded in shadow. Its features were indistinct, but it was watching me. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. The figure didn't move. Then slowly, it raised an arm and pointed directly at me. I backed into the RV, slamming the door shut. My hands shook as I locked it, trying to convince myself it was just a trick of the light or some camper playing a prank. But deep down, I knew better. The next morning, I found deep scratches on the RV's side, parallel grooves like claw marks. My stomach churned. I checked the footage from the night before, but the camera was corrupted. The footage was static, filled with flickering, distorted images. Determined to get answers, I hiked back up to the ridge. This time, the symbols were everywhere. They were carved into the trees, etched into rocks, even scratched into the dirt. The humming started again, louder, more persistent. I reached the crash site of my drone, but it wasn't there. Instead, I found a torn backpack, its contents scattered. Water bottle, map, trail guide. No sign of the owner. As I examined the site, I felt the air grow colder. A shadow passed over me, and I turned to see the figure from the night before, standing just a few feet away. It wasn't human. Its limbs were too long, its face shrouded in darkness, except for its glowing, ember-like eyes. I ran back to camp. I tried to start the RV, but the engine wouldn't turn over. The figure appeared again, standing at the edge of the clearing. This time it stepped closer. "Why are you here?" a voice hissed, low and guttural. My mind raced. I remembered Vanessa, the local historian I'd spoken to before coming here. She had warned me about the area's history, that a coven of witches had been executed here centuries ago for summoning spirits to protect their land. "I didn't mean to intrude," I stammered. "I'll leave. Just let me go." The figure tilted its head, as if considering my words. Then it raised a hand, and the symbols around the campsite began to glow, forming a circle of light that trapped me inside. The voice returned, louder this time. "You seek truth, where none is welcome. Leave this place, or be consumed by it." Desperate, I searched through my gear for anything I could use. I found a small bag of salt, an old trick I'd learned for warding off spirits. I poured it around the RV, forming a crude barrier. The figure screamed, a sound that rattled the ground beneath me. It lunged at the barrier but couldn't cross it. "Stay away," I shouted, holding the salt bag like a shield. The figure recoiled, its glowing eyes fixed on me as it faded into the trees. By dawn, the symbols had disappeared, and the RV's engine started without issue. I didn't look back as I drove away, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly, my knuckles turned white. When I reviewed the footage later, most of it was unusable, blurry, distorted, filled with static. But one clip stood out. The figure standing on the ridge, its glowing eyes staring directly into the camera. I uploaded the video to my channel, knowing it would be dismissed as a hoax. That was fine by me. Some truths are better left unexplained. My name is Chris Davis, and I'm 24 years old. This happened last fall in the wilderness of Pine Ridge, West Virginia. I went there with my brother Tyler, his girlfriend Nora, and his best friend Alex. We'd planned a week-long camping trip, a break from the daily grind. But what was supposed to be a relaxing getaway turned into a nightmare I can barely talk about now. It all started with a simple idea. Tyler, 29, was always the adventurous one, someone who thought a marked trail was too easy. I agreed to go because I needed to document local flora for my biology thesis. Nora, 26, came along because she loved spooky stories, and Alex, 25, was just happy to get out of his office. We made an odd group, but we were excited. We parked the RV at the Pine Ridge trailhead and set off into the thick woods. The air smelled of pine and earth, and sunlight filtered through the trees. Pine Ridge, the highest peak in the area, loomed in the distance. Tyler convinced us to take an unmarked route he'd found on an old map, and despite my reservations, we followed. The first couple of days were uneventful, apart from Alex's usual mishaps, like when he forgot a tent pole and had to duct tape his tent together. One of our flashlights died inexplicably, despite fresh batteries. Little annoyances, but nothing out of the ordinary. It was on the second night that things started to feel wrong. We set up camp near a clearing, surrounded by towering pines. The fire crackled, casting dancing shadows on the trunks. Nora had just finished telling us a creepy story about the children of the pines, ghostly figures that supposedly lured hikers to their deaths. Tyler groaned and threw a pine cone at her. "Enough with the ghost stories, Nora," he said. "You're gonna scare Alex." To his credit, Alex nervously laughed, but didn't say anything. That's when I noticed the silence. The usual nighttime chorus of crickets and owls had stopped completely. Even the wind was still. "Do you hear that?" I whispered. Tyler smirked. "I don't hear anything. That's the point. Peace and quiet." Nora's voice was tight. "Numbers, something's wrong. It's too quiet." Tyler rolled his eyes. "You two are just looking for something to be scared of." I tried to shake it off, but a gnawing unease crept into my chest. That night, I woke up to what sounded like footsteps circling our tents. Deliberate, soft, crunching on the forest floor. I held my breath, my heart pounding. "Chris," a voice whispered. It sounded like Tyler. I unzipped my tent slowly and peeked out. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a faint glow. Just beyond the light, I saw Tyler's silhouette standing by the trees. "What are you doing?" I hissed. He didn't respond. The figure turned and walked into the woods. I grabbed my flashlight and followed, thinking he was sleepwalking. But when I reached the spot where I'd seen him, he was gone. No footprints in the dirt. When I got back to the tents, Tyler was snoring loudly inside. The next morning, I told the group what I'd seen, but Tyler just laughed it off. "You were dreaming," he said. "Too many ghost stories, Nora." "I wasn't dreaming," I snapped. "I saw him." Alex looked uneasy, but stayed quiet. Nora just stared at the ground. We packed up and continued hiking, but the atmosphere had shifted. Tyler's usual confidence started to annoy me. Nora kept glancing over her shoulder, and Alex wasn't making his usual jokes. By midday, we came across something strange, a set of tracks in the dirt. They looked human but larger, with elongated toes and claw marks at the tips. "What kind of animal leaves tracks like that?" I asked. Tyler crouched down, frowning. "Probably a bear with a weird gait." "Bears don't have claws like that," Nora said, her voice trembling. Tyler shrugged. "Then maybe Bigfoot." But I couldn't relax. The tracks led straight toward our campsite. That night was worse. We built a larger fire and sat close to it, like the flames could protect us. Tyler and Nora argued about whether we should turn back, and Alex stayed silent, staring into the fire like it held answers. Then we heard it. Laughter. It was faint at first, like children playing hide and seek in the distance, but it grew louder, circling our camp. "Who's there?" Tyler shouted, grabbing his flashlight. The beam flickered and went out. He smacked it against his palm, but it stayed dead. "Chris." The voice was back, soft and lilting. This time it wasn't just Tyler's voice. It was joined by Nora's, then Alex's, all of them calling my name. "Stay by the fire," Nora whispered, clutching my arm. "Don't leave the light." Tyler ignored her and stepped into the darkness. "Tyler, no!" I shouted. But he disappeared into the trees. We waited, calling for him, but he didn't answer. Then he stumbled back into the firelight. His face was pale, his eyes wide. "It's not human," he said, his voice shaking. Before we could ask what he meant, the creature emerged. It stood just beyond the firelight, its form flickering like a mirage. One moment it looked like Tyler, then Nora, then me. Its face stretched into an unnatural grin, glowing yellow eyes fixed on us. Nora screamed. Alex stumbled back, scrambling away from the fire. "Salt!" Nora shouted suddenly. "We need salt." I grabbed the packets from our food stash, ripped them open, and threw them around the fire. The creature hissed and recoiled, its form blurring before it vanished into the shadows. We didn't sleep that night. Tyler finally admitted we needed to leave. But the next morning, when we reached the RV, we found the tires slashed, claw marks gouged into the doors. "It doesn't want us to leave," Nora said, her voice hollow. "Then we walk," I said. "We'll head to the ranger station." The hike was grueling. Every sound in the forest set us on edge. The feeling of being watched never left. By midday, the creature returned. It didn't attack, but it followed us, always just out of sight. Sometimes it looked like Nora, sometimes like Tyler, sometimes like something completely inhuman. When we reached a narrow trail along a cliffside, it attacked. The creature lunged at Tyler, who fought it off with a burning stick from our campfire. "Go!" he shouted. "Get to the station." "Tyler, no!" I screamed. But he wouldn't listen. He stood his ground, his shadow long against the rocks, his eyes fixed on the creature. We ran. We reached the ranger station at dawn, our legs burning, lungs gasping for air. The creature didn't follow us into the sunlight, but Tyler was gone. Even now, I dream of him standing at the edge of the woods, his yellow eyes glowing, whispering, "Come back." I never will. My name is Mara Caldwell, and I'm 28 years old. This happened along Paint Creek Scenic Trail in West Virginia during a trip I had planned to reconnect with my art and with myself. It was supposed to be a peaceful escape from the noise of the world, but instead, it became something I still can't fully explain. I had just come out of a long relationship that ended in the kind of breakup that leaves you questioning everything. Your choices, your direction, your worth. Art was the only thing that felt steady, so I packed up my RV and hit the road. Paint Creek had come up in my research as a serene, lesser-known spot for nature lovers, and I thought it would be the perfect place to spend a few days sketching and painting in solitude. When I arrived, the place was exactly as described: quiet, secluded, and hauntingly beautiful. The creek meandered through dense woods, its surface catching the sunlight like shards of glass. The leaves were just beginning to turn, and the air carried a faint chill that hinted at the coming fall. I parked my RV near an old wooden bridge that crossed the creek. The bridge looked like it belonged in a ghost story, its weathered boards sagging slightly, but I couldn't resist its charm. I set up camp and spent the first day wandering the trails, sketching the landscape. The stillness was almost too perfect, but I chalked it up to being unused to this level of isolation. That night, I sat by the creek, working on a watercolor of the bridge. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the forest around me grew darker, and the silence became oppressive. There were no birds, no insects, just the sound of the water trickling over rocks. I tried to focus on my painting, but a strange unease crept over me. The air seemed to shift, growing heavier, colder. Then I heard it, a faint humming. It was soft at first, almost melodic, but it didn't seem to have a source. It wasn't coming from the creek or the woods. It was just there. I froze, my brush hovering over the paper. The sound grew louder, more distinct, and I realized it was a woman's voice, humming a tune I didn't recognize. "Hello," I called out, my voice breaking the stillness. The humming stopped abruptly, as if I'd startled it. For a long moment, there was nothing but silence. I told myself it must have been the wind, or some trick of acoustics. I packed up my supplies and hurried back to the RV. The next morning, I woke to find my art supplies scattered across the ground outside the RV. My brushes were snapped in half, my paints spilled and smeared across the dirt. My first thought was that an animal had gotten into them, but there were no paw prints, no signs of disturbance, just the destruction itself. It didn't make sense. I spent the day trying to paint, but something felt off. The colors didn't look right, and the lines felt shaky. Frustrated, I decided to take a break and explore more of the area. The old bridge drew me in again, its weathered planks creaking under my boots as I crossed it. The creek below was impossibly still, its surface like a mirror reflecting the gnarled tree overhead. On the far side of the bridge, I noticed something etched into one of the trees, a name and a date carved deep into the bark. Margaret, 1893. The letters were uneven, as if done in haste, but what caught my attention was the feeling that swept over me as I touched the carving. A sudden, overwhelming sadness that didn't feel like my own. That night, the humming returned. I was inside the RV trying to sketch when I heard it again, drifting through the stillness. It was louder this time, unmistakable. The sound seemed to seep through the walls, wrapping around me like a cold embrace. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, my heart pounding. The air was icy, much colder than it had been earlier, and the forest was eerily quiet. The humming led me to the bridge, where the fog had thickened, shrouding the creek in an otherworldly glow. And then I saw her. She stood at the edge of the creek, her back to me. She wore a long dress, the kind you'd see in old photographs, and her hair cascaded down her back in dark waves. She was humming that same mournful tune, the sound weaving through the air like a spell. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling. She stopped humming but didn't turn around. I took a hesitant step closer, and as I did, she began to dissolve. Her form broke apart like mist, until there was nothing left but the fog. I stood there, frozen, unsure if what I had seen was real, or some trick of the light, or my overactive imagination. The next day, I decided to drive into town to clear my head. At a small gas station, I struck up a conversation with the attendant, an older man who seemed to know the area well. "You're camping by the bridge, aren't you?" he asked when I mentioned Paint Creek. "Yeah, why?" He hesitated. "People say it's haunted. They call her the Lady of Paint Creek. Story goes, she was abandoned by her husband during a harsh winter. He promised to come back for her, but he never did. She waited by that bridge until she froze to death. Now, she haunts the creek, looking for people to join her." I laughed nervously, but his expression remained serious. "I'd avoid that bridge if I were you," he added, "especially at night." That evening, I couldn't stay away. Something about the Lady of Paint Creek drew me in like a moth to a flame. I set up my easel near the bridge, determined to capture her essence in my painting. As the hours passed and the sun dipped below the horizon, the fog rolled in again, and the humming returned. This time, it was louder, more insistent. The air around me grew colder, and when I looked up, there she was, standing in the middle of the bridge. Her face was pale, almost translucent, and her hollow eyes bore into mine. She didn't move, but the humming turned into words, a whisper that sent chills down my spine. "Stay with me." I backed away, but my foot slipped on the wet grass, and I fell. When I looked up, she was gone, but the feeling of her presence lingered, heavy and suffocating. I grabbed my supplies and ran back to the RV, locking the door behind me. That night, I dreamed of her. In the dream, I was standing on the bridge, staring down at the ice-cold water. She appeared beside me, her hand cold as she touched my arm. "He left me," she whispered. Her voice was filled with sorrow. "They all leave." When I woke, I couldn't shake the feeling that she was still there, just beyond the edges of my vision. I knew I had to do something to break her hold on me. On my final night at Paint Creek, I returned to the bridge with my sketchbook and paints. The fog was thicker than ever, and the cold seeped into my bones. I set up my supplies and began to paint, my hands trembling as I worked. I painted her story, the bridge, the creek, her lonely figure waiting in the snow. As I finished, the humming surrounded me, and she appeared again, this time closer. Her hollow eyes were filled with tears, and she reached out a hand toward the painting. I stepped back, unsure of what to do. "You're remembered now," I said. "My way breaking. You're not forgotten."